We're big fans of Star Wars The Clone Wars, and it's a fair bet that most of you are too. The Clone Wars was a terrific show with plenty of valuable messages for kids and adults alike, and lots of great story arcs. But even though The Clone Wars was a fairly deep show that posed plenty of interesting moral questions, a lot of the time, the morality of the series was pretty black and white. The clones and Jedi were almost always the heroes, while the Separatist foes were almost always depicted as evil, especially the Separatist leadership. However, as we've discussed in the past, the Clone Wars wasn't clear-cut. Recently, we questioned whether the clones really deserve to be considered the good guys, and in this video, we'll be considering the opposite question: were the Separatists truly evil?
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Unlike with the Grand Army of the Republic, the Confederacy of Independent Systems was anything but uniform. While we could treat the clones as a block when considering whether or not they were the heroes in that previous video, it's much harder to do so for the Separatists. The CIS was a coalition of a great many factions with many interests jostling for control of the Confederacy. The main factions fall into two camps. Some were inarguably evil and worse than the Republic, while others were more or less justified in their actions with noble or at least understandable reasons for siding with Dooku. Let's start by identifying the baddies. Everyone on the Separatist Council and most of their lackeys fell into the indefensibly evil category. This includes General Grievous, one of the most accomplished mass murderers in galactic history, as well as all the corporate leaders who underwrote the CIS military. Newt Gunray and his pals were all scum of the highest order, soulless beings who cared about nothing but their profits. The mega corporations they led, the Trade Federation, Techno Union, Commerce Guild, and others, ruthlessly exploited thousands of worlds, forcing many to join the CIS. A number of separatist worlds, among them Nemoidia, Mokana, and Munilinst, seceded willingly due to strong economic ties with the Separatist Council corporations. But these companies gave many other worlds no choice. The Trade Federation and its allies outright owned many planets, and they might as well have owned many more due to monopolies on trade and various sectors of local economies. Planets like Miriel and Drukenwell seceded from the Republic for no reason of their own, but because the Trade Federation would cut trade with them otherwise. This could have caused billions of deaths by starvation. It's worth noting that many of the Separatist factions that we consider justified in their secession left the Republic because it had a long history of economic exploitation. But the Separatist Council factors were every bit as bad as the Republic in this regard, if not worse. They stripped entire planets of resources, enslaved populations, and tested weapons on innocent sentients. Indeed, mega corporations like the Trade Federation were actually the ones responsible for most of the Republic's worst historical abuses. The Republic deserves some blame for these atrocities, since it tolerated and often supported the exploitation of the Rim, but most of the time it was powerful private factions such as the infamous Zerka Corporation that did the dirty work. Lastly, before we move on, we'd like to note another important addition to the evil pile: Count Dooku. While Dooku posed as a noble idealist and staunch separatist, his actual beliefs couldn't have been more different from what he preached. As we discussed in a video a few months ago, Dooku was a fascist who wanted to enslave and expropriate all non-human species. He was never a real separatist, but a fanatical supporter of the Empire. He formed and led the Confederacy as a sort of controlled opposition. He lured in morally bankrupt corporate factions and rimworlds with legitimate concerns, many of them alien-dominated, so that the Empire had an excuse to destroy them all. Speaking of rimworlds with legitimate concerns, let's talk about the more decent separatists. These factions were the originators of the separatist movement, the base that Dooku initially appealed to when forming the Confederacy. Their causes were numerous and varied wildly, but they were united by their resentment of the Republic. As we mentioned earlier, this resentment was usually justified. Many rimworlds had their resources taken by the Republic or Republic-backed corporations and got nothing but pirate raids in return. And the CIS was filled with systems like that. We reckon most systems in the Confederacy had a good reason for seceding. Some were resource-rich worlds, like Yukio and Agama, tired of being taken for granted by the wealthy core. Some believed they had been wronged by the Republic, such as Ando and Kaylee. Some, like Onderon and Selenon, had leaders who sympathized politically with the exploited systems of the Rim. Additionally, there were many planets in the Confederacy that seceded because they just didn't believe the whole Republic thing was working out. Yag'Dhul and Clak'dor 7 among them. While those worlds didn't really have a bad history with the Republic, as many other Separatist worlds did, they were totally within their rights to abandon what appeared to be a sinking ship, especially since, as we know, that ship became the Empire. Two of the Separatist worlds that seceded during the Clone Wars can shed some light on the perspectives of this oft-overlooked side of the Confederacy: Umbara and Jabiim. Jabiim had suffered terribly from plagues and slaver raids during its time in the Republic, receiving no aid of any kind due to its remoteness. When it was discovered that Jabiim had a valuable ore, however, the Republic suddenly took a great interest in the planet, moving to nationalize the ore for use in its war effort. It should come as no surprise that the Jabiimi reacted to this with violence. A Separatist faction overthrew the government and declared the planet a member of the CIS, since the Separatists were offering to buy Jabiim's ore instead of just taking it. That was a perfectly good reason to secede in our book. The Umbarans, meanwhile, were loyal members of the Republic through the first year of the Clone Wars, until their senator, Medici, was murdered. He was assassinated in his own office in the Senate building, an insult that told the Umbarans that Count Dooku was right about the Republic's irreparable corruption. Thus, Umbara decided to exercise their right to self-determination and switch sides. The Republic responded with a full invasion, fearing that Umbara's secession would cut off military supply lines, and the Umbarans were forced to fight tooth and nail for their homes. As we concluded in a video a few months ago, the Umbarans too did nothing wrong. As we hope we've shown, the Confederacy of Independent Systems was a mixed bag. Its supporters included some of the worst beings in the universe, oppressed populations that were entirely in the right, and many factions that lay somewhere in the middle. If you're wondering how all these different factions ended up on the same team, remember that, at the end of the day, the Sith were pulling the strings from behind the scenes. The CIS would never have formed organically, at least not as we saw it in the Clone Wars. Without Sith interference, the Separatist movement probably would have become something more like the Rebel Alliance. With that said, how do we go about assessing the CIS as a whole? Our approach will be to determine who, aside from the Sith, ultimately held the greatest share of power within the Confederacy. In other words, we'll be judging the CIS based on who it really represented. The Separatist Council and their allies had a great deal of power in the Confederacy, obviously, since they pretty much controlled the CIS military. Most of the Confederacy's industry was under Council control, and Newt Gunray and his pals had near total command of the droid army, with their authority second only to Dooku and Grievous. But the Council wasn't the official governing body of the Confederacy. The CIS was actually led, at least officially, by the Separatist Parliament, based on Raxus Secundus. The balance of power in Parliament was radically different than it was on the Separatist Council. As Star Wars The Clone Wars showed us, the Separatist Parliament was mostly composed of the other sort of Separatists, the noble idealists or representatives of those beings who had legitimately suffered at the Republic's hands. The Parliament represented the actual people of the Confederacy, the independent systems that gave the CIS its name. These systems had a substantial amount of power, and the Parliament, which by all accounts was far less corrupt than the Galactic Senate, managed most of the Confederacy's official state business. The Parliament was generally at odds with the Separatist Council, with many in Parliament resenting the mega-corporations and asserting that it was the people, not the Trade Federation, that controlled the CIS. Unfortunately, they were wrong. If it wanted to, the Separatist Council could have overruled nearly any decision made by the Parliament. The corporate factions in the CIS blatantly disregarded the Confederacy's own laws, carrying out abuses forbidden by Parliament and enslaving planets captured by the droid army. But we wouldn't go so far as to say that the Council had complete control over the CIS. At the end of the day, the Parliament existed for a reason. If it didn't, then the ordinary Separatists within the CIS would have left, and the power of the Council would have decreased significantly. Though the two sides hated each other, they needed to share power. Without the council, the CIS would have been crushed by the Grand Army of the Republic, and if not for the more idealistic separatists, the council would have had no base of support to fall back on. Our judgment is that the Confederacy itself wasn't evil, but it wasn't good either. As a whole, it lay somewhere in the middle. It was closer to evil than good, we would say, considering how much power the Separatist Council possessed, but the people of the Rim still had a fair degree of power in the CIS, which tempered it out a little bit. But that's just our take. And what do you think? Was the Confederacy good, evil, or something in between? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.